Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study Podcast, where we explore and explain the Bible one chapter at a time. My name is Luke, and I am thy host for today's podcast. Today, we're talking about Genesis chapter 14. Let's go ahead and read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. And while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study again together sometime. I will tell you, before we read the text, that there are a lot of hard names in here, and you may pronounce them differently than me. I apologize if I don't share your pronunciation. Also, somehow this weekend, I seemed to have come across a cough, and it's been irritating my voice a little bit, and so my voice may be a little bit raspy. I do apologize about the sound. Genesis 14 has 24 verses. Let's read them together. Let's see if we can do it in one take. Doubtful. In the days of Amraphel, the king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of Goyim, these kings made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. And all these joined forces in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they had served Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Sheva Kiriathaim, and the Horites in the hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the borders of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En-Meshpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. Then the king of Sodom, king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out, and they joined the battle in the valley of Siddim, with Kedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Goyim, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits, and as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled to the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, who was living by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Aner. These were allies of Abram. When Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men, born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobah, north of Damascus. Then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions, and the women and the people. After his return from the defeat of Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Sheva, that is, the king's valley. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." And Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the persons, but take the goods for yourself." But Abram said to the king of Sodom, "I have lifted my hand to the Lord, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, that I would not take a thread or a sandal strap or anything that is yours, lest you should say, 'I have made Abram rich.' I will take nothing but what the young men have eaten and the share of the men who went with me. Let Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre take their share." And so that is the text of Genesis chapter 14. Full disclosure, I did not make it through in one take. There's some difficult names in there, and also someone's doing construction and drilling upstairs, and so I didn't figure you wanted to hear the drill in the background. But anyway, we're going to try to keep these studies a little bit more concise than they had been. I think last study was like 30 minutes or something. I'm going to try to not do that again and keep them a little shorter. That, I guess, will depend on my discipline in how long I ramble. I will do my best. We'll see how it goes. Genesis 14, let's talk about context, talk about where we are, where we're picking up in this chapter. We've talked about how the first 11 chapters of Genesis are the introduction to the world that we live in. In chapter 3, we talked about how the problem of sin and death are introduced into the world through mankind's disobedience. We've talked about how God has been leading us up to this point of being introduced to Abram. And Abram is the man through whom God is ultimately going to solve these problems of sin and death. He's not going to do it through Abraham directly or during his lifetime, but he's going to do it through Abram's descendants. You remember, God made some really key promises, really important promises to Abram. Do you remember what they were? It's kind of a three-part promise. First, he promised to give Abram's descendants the land of Canaan as their homeland. Second, he promised to make Abram a great nation. He's going to have lots and lots of descendants coming from him. And then number three, through Abram's descendants, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. So that's kind of the context. That's where we're picking up. We're picking up in the key details of Abram's life. In today's chapter, we're going to talk about a battle that Abram got involved in. This related to his nephew, Lot, and it relates to kind of the landscape of the ancient world in that area. So some pretty important stuff in terms of laying some groundwork here. So let's talk about it. Let's go to our outline and talk about, first of all, when the events happened, and then our characters, and then where these events played out. Number one, when. We know that Abraham lived 175 years, from 1996 BC to about 1821 BC. The events that are recorded in Genesis 14 happened sometime between 1921 and 1896 BC. And I definitely encourage you to download our free PDF, as these dates will be much clearer and much easier to remember if they're all written down and laid out for you nice and neatly, instead of trying to keep them all straight in your head. Now we come to our main characters. We have Abram, of course, who I keep calling Abraham, I'm sorry. Abram, a man from Ur of the Chaldeans, who moved to Canaan at God's instructions. God promised to bless all the nations of the earth through his descendants. We have Lot, again, Abram's nephew, who lived near the city of Sodom. And then we have 9 warring kings. We have 5 kings who fought against an army of 4 kings. We'll talk about these guys a little bit more in the outline. And then our really interesting character, and there's so much that could be said about him that I think we probably won't get to in this study. That'll probably be for our Hebrews study. But this is Melchizedek. Melchizedek is described as being a king. He is the king of Salem, and he is priest of God Most High. So he is a king and he is a priest. It's pretty interesting. We don't read about that too many times. I can think of one in the Bible, and that would be Jesus, the king and the priest. But before I go down the rabbit hole of Melchizedek, we should probably move on. And I don't know. It's hard to. The reason my studies end up being 30 minutes long is because there's all these interesting things to discuss and these ideas. Who is this Melchizedek? How much time should I spend talking about him? It's hard to limit myself sometimes, but I'm going to do it here, and I think I'm going to leave the Melchizedek discussion mostly for the book of Hebrews and for your personal study. But, if you want to dig into it more in your free time, feel free. There's a lot to get into. Okay, to the map. Got to move on. The key battles that are discussed in this chapter, they occur in the Valley of Siddim. Now, that's a debated location. These locations in the really ancient world sometimes are pretty hard to lock down. So the Valley of Siddim, perhaps around the Dead Sea area. Abram pursued his nephew's kidnappers from Hebron, which was where the Oaks of Mamre were located, to Dan. And you can see both of those places on the map on the PDF. They are quite separated. We'll talk about just how far they were apart in our application section. Abram has quite a journey pursuing his nephew's kidnappers, going all the way up to the city of Damascus. And then finally, we talk about Melchizedek meeting Abram in the Valley of Sheva. This is the King's Valley. Now, there's some people who believe that this is one of the 2 valleys that actually surround the city of Jerusalem, either the Kidron Valley or the Hinnom Valley. Don't know that we can say that for sure, but this may have been around what would become the city of Jerusalem. Now, we can go over to our outline section and break this chapter down, make sure we comprehend what we just read. It's kind of complicated if you're just reading through because there's all these names and they can make it a little bit difficult to keep the flow of the idea. But let's try to do that now. So chapter 14, I've got it in 2 sections. The first one is verses 1 through 16. And I've entitled this section, Abram Saves Lot After He Is Taken Captive. Chapter 14 starts off with a war. 4 kings ally themselves and they fight together against a group of 5 other kings. So this group of 4 include these guys. Number 1, Amraphel of Shinar. Number 2, Arioch of Elasar. 3, Kedorlaomer of Elam. And 4, Tidal of Goyim. This other group of 5 consists of Bera of Sodom, Birsha of Gomorrah, Shinab of Admah, Shemeber of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar. It's not essential that you memorize who is in what group, but the names are given repeatedly in this chapter. So if you want them all kind of cleanly laid out, they're on the PDF. But just know, 4 kings against 5 kings. This war between these guys started when the 5 kings rebelled against this guy named Chedorlaomer, who seems to be the leader, after they had served him for 12 years. So they seem to have been subjected to him for 12 years. Then the 13th year, they get tired of it and they rebel. So these are the 5 kings rebelling against Chedorlaomer. One of the key battles took place in this place called the Valley of Siddim, when the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fought Chedorlaomer and his allies. The kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, they end up losing the battle. They're part of the group of 5. They end up losing the battle and they have to run away. And they end up getting all their stuff, their cities, all their possessions were taken captive by the enemy forces. Said that some of them were stuck in bitumen pits. We've seen that word bitumen a couple times, and I had to look it up. I had kind of like a loose idea of what it is, but here's kind of the technical definition of it. A black viscous mixture of hydrocarbons obtained naturally or as a residue from petroleum. It is used for road surfacing and roofing. So this is kind of like from what I understand, it's kind of like a tar, and it grows. I don't know if it grows, but it appears naturally in this part of the world. At least it did. And so they're fleeing, but it's pretty hard to flee when you're trying to run through tar. And so this is something that hangs them up. And they end up, losing the battle. The whole thing's a disaster. All their possessions are taken by Chedorlaomer and his allies. Now, we're told that Lot, who was Abram's nephew, who we mentioned in the last chapter, had moved his tent near Sodom when he chose to go east. When Abram gave him the choice of land, remember, he moves east and he moves around Sodom. So he's kind of caught up in this battle, and all of his stuff is also captured, not only his stuff, but the people of his household, and he himself is taken captive by Chedorlaomer, and then he's taken north. Well, one of the survivors of this battle goes to this place called the Oaks of Mamre, which was at Hebron. This is where Abram had his tent, and he informs Abram that his nephew has been taken captive. Upon hearing this, Abram rallies his personal army. He has 318 trained men from his household, and he takes them and he pursues Lot's captors. And we learn a couple things here with this fact that's kind of interesting. Number one, we're not talking about like massive armies here. Abram has 318 men, and he goes and he ends up defeating Chedorlaomer. And from what we understand, this isn't some kind of miraculous defeat like Gideon had over the Midianites or something like that. We're talking about smaller armies. So these are probably like local kings over smaller regions. We're not talking about world powers with armies of 100,000 men. Another thing we find out, though, is that, hey, look, if you have 318 men who are in fighting shape, who you can rally to run marathons upon marathons to go chase down captives, you're doing pretty well for yourself, right? Abram has a lot of people under his authority, and in his household, he's very, very wealthy, and we were told that in the last chapter. So those are just some interesting observations from that fact. Abram takes his men, and he overtakes Chedorlaomer and his men. He divides his army, he goes in at night, and he defeats them, chasing them all the way to this place called Hobah, which is north of the city of Damascus. If I'm not mistaken, Damascus is actually the oldest inhabited city in the world, or maybe I should say the oldest continually inhabited city in the world. Damascus has been around forever. And so if you ever have a chance to go to, I believe it's in modern day Syria, Damascus might be worth checking out. Maybe not the safest place to go right now, but who knows, maybe in the future. So Abram defeats Chedorlaomer and his allies, and then he brings Lot and his family and all of his possessions back to their homeland. That brings us to section number 2, where we have this meeting between Abram and Melchizedek. This is verses 17 through 24. So Bera, who is the king of Sodom, Lot's city, and this guy named Melchizedek, who just kind of appears here, he's the king of Salem. They met Abram at this valley of Sheva. when he returns from his victory, which again may have been close to what would later become the city of Jerusalem. Melchizedek is described, as I mentioned, as a king and as the priest of God Most High. Melchizedek blesses Abraham, and Abraham then in return gives him a tenth of all of his possessions. Now, this doesn't seem like a super significant event until it's brought up by the writer of Hebrews later on in the New Testament. What we find out is that even though Abram is kind of God's selected man through whom his promises are flowing, Melchizedek is actually superior to Abram. We find this out because the writer of Hebrews says that the one who is greater blesses the lesser, and the lesser pays tithes to the greater. Melchizedek is the one who's doing the blessing. So he's greater than Abram. Abraham gives him tithes. He's less than Melchizedek. So this guy who appears on the scene here is a priest of God Most High. Now, interestingly, this is before the priesthood as described in the book of Leviticus, for example, before God ordains priests through Aaron. So interestingly, this guy is a priest of God. How? Where? How did he get this authority? What's going on here? And the text just really doesn't tell us. We're just told that he's God's priest, and he holds this really revered place of being even greater than Abram himself. That's all we're going to say about Melchizedek for today. Well, I have one other lesson that I'll discuss at the end, but if you want to, look into that yourself. There are all kinds of interesting reading to be done about Melchizedek. Well, the last thing I want to mention here is the last part of the chapter. The king of Sodom offers all of the spoils of the war to Abram. But Abram refuses them because he doesn't want it to be said that the king of Sodom made him rich. He wants everyone to know that it's God who made him rich. And he certainly doesn't want to take spoils from the king of Sodom, because do you remember the way that Sodom was described in, I believe it was the last chapter? It was that Sodom was super wicked, that the people who lived there were great sinners against the Lord. So Abram doesn't want to take this, maybe what he perceives as kind of dirty money. He doesn't want people saying the king of Sodom, somehow made him the man that he was. It was God who made him the man that he was. So that pretty much brings us to the end of chapter 14. And I do want to make one other comment about Melchizedek and what we can observe in him. I mentioned that he's a priest, but we don't have any information about what kind of priest he was, other than that he was God's priest, or where he got his ordination, when it happened, what he's a priest over. And this tells us something that is kind of interesting, and that is that God had interactions with people outside of those who we have record of in the scriptures. So we are going to follow Abram's descendants through the Old Testament. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Abram's descendants were the only people that God had any kind of interactions with. Clearly, he ordains Melchizedek, and Melchizedek isn't related to Abram in any way by blood. And so God is doing a lot of things outside of what we read about specifically in the Bible with these other nations of the world. You see that again in the story of Jonah. If you know Jonah, who got swallowed by the fish, God has these dealings with the nation of Assyria, and we don't know all that was going on there, right? But he's concerned about them, and he sends Jonah to preach to them so that they repent. So God is doing other things that we aren't going to read about directly in the scriptures in the ancient world. And that's just something to keep in mind. This is not an exhaustive record of all of God's dealings in the ancient past. It's just a selection of them that he has chosen to give to us. So that's all I'm going to say for Genesis chapter 14. Hopefully it was a little bit more concise and to the point. Let's talk about our application as we finish up. In our day, the term patriarch and patriarchy are usually thought of in a negative light. But in Genesis chapter 14, we see portrayed a patriarch, Abram, the fatherly head of his household. We see this patriarch in a positive and a godly way. A patriarch is a man who leads and protects his household. A real patriarch is a man who leads and protects even when fulfilling that duty requires great personal sacrifice. The reason that I withheld the information about how far Dan was from Hebron is because I want to bring it up here to kind of drive home this point. In order to save his nephew, Abram had to pursue his kidnappers on foot with his 318 men for approximately 150 miles. How many marathons is that? It's like 5 and some extra, right? Maybe close to 6. So he's running 6 marathons to run down his nephew and save him from Chedorlaomer, who has kidnapped him and is taking him to the north. Abram's example teaches modern men that leading a house isn't about making everyone submit to your will while you lounge around in ease. Telling people, you'll make me a sandwich, or do this or that I don't want to do myself. That's the way that patriarchy is often portrayed, as the lazy man sitting around while everyone else does his bidding and has to listen to him, right? But that's not at all what we see in Abram. Leading like Abram and like Jesus, who's really the perfect example of this, means protecting and providing for those who are in your care, often at great personal expense. I'm sure that there are other things that Abram would have rather been doing than running 150 miles to save his kidnapped nephew, right? But he had to do that. Why? Because it was his duty. That was his job as the provider, as the protector, as the patriarch of that family. And we see him very honorably fulfilling that duty, even though it wasn't something easy for him to do. That's the definition of a real patriarch. That is our study for today in Genesis chapter 14. Thanks for coming along and joining with us. If you haven't left us a review in your podcast player, please do that. 5 stars would be greatly appreciated. That helps to get the word out and helps for other people to be able to find this podcast and hopefully get into the scriptures and know God better. Lord willing, we'll be back tomorrow with Genesis chapter 15. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic day.